Assalamu alaikum everybody. This is part 3 of the Salat series, and in this video we'll look into the Quran to understand the wisdom behind observing the contact prayers or as-salat. So we know that the salat is a practice which involves actions like bowing, prostrating, standing up, glorifying God and His names, etc. But this is not unique to Islam. We see such practices in other religions as well. And such practices are often considered as spiritual practices. So is the salat a spiritual practice? And if it is, why do we need such spiritual practices? Inshallah, in this video we will examine certain Quranic verses to understand the purpose and the wisdom behind the contact prayers.
There is such a thing as food for the soul, nourishment for the real person. And the strange thing that is not known yet, is not commonly known anyway, is that just as the body grows, the real person or the soul grows in leaps and bounds. And this makes it even more important to nourish and feed the real person. Now, what is the food for the soul? The evidence, by the way, comes from the Creator, from God Himself. And He tells us that we must make contact with God every day to cause this nutrition and nourishment of the soul. Because the soul is literally a piece of God.
Here Dr. Rashad Khalifa speaks about the human soul and also says that it is literally a piece of God. He also speaks about the need to nourish and expand the soul by making contact with God. But let's look into the Quran to understand this better. We see this in Surah 32 verse 9, where God says, ثُمَّ سَوَّاهُ وَنَفَخَ فِيهِ مِنْ رُوحِي وَجَعَلَ لَكُمُ السَّمْعَ وَالْأَبْصَارَ وَالْأَفْئِدَةَ قَلِيلًا مَا تَشْكُرُونَ, which means He shaped him and blew into him from His spirit, and He gave you the hearing, the eyesight, and the brains. Rarely are you thankful. Now let's analyze this verse. At the beginning of the verse, God says that He blew into us from His spirit, which is min ruhi. These are the key words. And this tells us that the human soul comes from the Spirit of God. Or in other words, we can say that the Divine Spirit exists within us. And this is why we heard Dr. Rashad Khalifa saying that the soul is literally a piece of God. This verse also teaches us that we are not creatures with merely a body, but also a soul. Now let's look at another verse which further explains this. We can see this in Surah 30 verse 30. God says, فَأَقِمْ وَجْهَكَ لِلدِّينِ حَنِيفًا فِطْرَةَ اللَّهِ الَّتِي فَطَرَ النَّاسَ عَلَيْهَا لَا تَبْدِيلَ لِخَلْقِ اللَّهِ ذَلِكَ الدِّينُ الْقَيِّمُ وَلَكِنَّ أَكْثَرَ النَّاسِ لَا يَعْلَمُونَ. Here the Quran is speaking about a natural state or a natural instinct that exists within every human being. God says, therefore you shall devote yourself to the religion of strict monotheism. Such is the natural instinct placed into the people by God. Such creation of God will never change. This is the perfect religion, but most people do not know. Let's go back to the Arabic verse. We can see فَأَقِمْ وَجْهَكَ لِلدِّينِ حَنِيفًا. This is speaking about a path or a religion which is monotheism in a sense. And God says, فِطْرَةَ اللَّهِ الَّتِي فَطَرَ النَّاسَ عَلَيْهَا, that God has placed a divine nature. But why do I call it a divine nature? Because if you look at the word fitrat, it speaks about nature. Fitra is talking about nature, and it says fitrat Allahi. This has been translated as made by Allah. But if you look in the Arabic, it doesn't say made or of or from or anything of that sort. It says simply fitrat Allah. So it's a divine nature. If you just take the Arabic as it is without adding these additional meanings to it, you will see that the Arabic simply says fitrat Allah. So it's talking about a divine nature. And when we study this in conjunction with Surah 32 verse 9, we can see that this fitra or the natural instinct or divine nature was placed into us when God blew into us from His Spirit. This is why every human being has a natural inclination towards believing in a higher power and finding out the meaning of life. And it is the divine nature or the fitra that makes us compassionate, loving, caring, forgiving, creative, and courageous with a strong desire to fight for our freedom. And it is these and many more divine qualities that make up the human soul. But unfortunately, as the Quran says, most people do not know. Now let's go back to the video of Dr. Rashad Khalifa once again.
And now we have specific methods of developing the person, the soul, and exactly what to do and when, and the most efficient ways and the least efficient ways. We now possess this valuable information, and we're told that you must make contact with God, your Creator, 5 times a day. This contact, you can think of ropes coming down from the Creator and keeping us out of this sizzling pan called the world. At the same time, we develop and we nourish ourself, the real self, the soul, by making these contacts 5 times a day.
To understand this, we'll have to go back to the verse, Surah 30, verse 30 again. It says that God has placed the divine nature or the natural instinct within human beings. And God says at the end of the verse, أَكْثَرَ النَّاسِ لَا يَعْلَمُونَ, that the majority of the people do not know. So this means that the majority of the people are unaware of their true nature, which is fitrat Allah. Which in other words means that the more unaware you are, the less in touch you are with your true nature. And the more aware you are, the more in touch you are with your true nature, true divine nature. Therefore, we have to grow our awareness to achieve more expansion of our true divine nature. And how do we achieve this awareness? We achieve this by going to the source or connecting with the source, which is God. The more we connect with our Creator, the more we expand and grow in our divine nature. So far we have learned where the soul comes from. The human soul comes from the divine spirit, and as a result of it, we have the divine nature within us. And in this video, Dr. Rashad Khalifa speaks about developing the soul by making contact with God. And this is why we see so many verses in the Quran which tells us to constantly remember God. In Arabic, it's called zikrullah. For example, in Surah 33:41, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu zkurullaha zikran kathira. O you who have believed, remember Allah with much remembrance. There is an emphasis throughout the Quran to constantly remember God. And the reason for this is very obvious. This is to ensure that our mind is dominated by the thoughts of God, free from other distractions. And this also ensures that we are constantly connected with God. But in a world full of distractions and other obligations in our daily lives, how can we achieve this? There has to be certain methods through which we can establish this constant remembrance and connection with God. Hence the need for certain spiritual practices. We learn from the Quran that Salat is a spiritual practice that helps us maintain this contact with God. We see this in Surah 29 verse 45, where God says, أَتْلُوا مَا أُوحِيَ إِلَيْكَ مِنَ الْكِتَابِ وَأَقِمُوا الصَّلَاةَ إِنَّ الصَّلَاةَ تَنْهَى عَنِ الْفَحْشَاءِ وَالْمُنْكَرِ وَلَذِكْرُ اللَّهِ أَكْبَرُ وَاللَّهُ يَعْلَمُ مَا تَصْنَعُونَ. The translation is, recite, O Muhammad, what has been revealed to you of the book, and established this prayer, the Salat. Indeed, the prayer, the Salat, prohibits immorality and wrongdoing, and the remembrance of Allah is greater. So from this it is clear that the wisdom or the purpose behind the Salat is to establish a constant contact with God by remembering Him. This also teaches us that the constant remembrance of God through the contact prayers ensures that we stay away from immorality and wrongdoing. This is because good thoughts eliminates bad thoughts, and God says in this verse, وَلَذِكْرُ اللَّهِ أَكْبَرُ, the remembrance of God is the greatest. So from this it is clear that the Salat is a ritual practice that helps us maintain the best thoughts throughout the day. The Salat is therefore a gift to us, to every believer. While there are multiple ways through which a believer can remember God, Salat stands out as the best and the most effective practice that ensures that we are able to maintain the best thoughts throughout the day. This is because, unlike all other forms of zikr, the Salat involves disrupting our daily lives, our commitments, and moving ourselves from our comfort zones in order to glorify, praise, and remember God at specific times of the day. And this is why God says that maintaining the Salat, the contact prayers, is indeed difficult for most people, but not so for the reverent. Unfortunately, most people are unaware of the purpose and the wisdom behind the Salat. Most perform the Salat either as a tradition or completely avoid doing this practice. But we know that avoiding the Salat or observing the Salat without the required knowledge will only lead to spiritual starvation and hence the loss of one's soul. We see this in Surah 7 verse 9, where God says, وَمَنْ خَفَّتْ مَوَازِينُهُ فَأُولَٰئِكَ الَّذِينَ خَسِرُوا أَنفُسَهُمْ بِمَا كَانُوا بِآيَاتِنَا يَظْلِمُونَ. Which means, as for those whose weights are light, they will be the ones who lost their souls as a consequence of disregarding our revelations unjustly. This tells us that failing to heed our Creator leads to spiritual starvation and eventual loss of the soul. With that, I conclude this video, and I hope that this video has given you a fresh perspective on the Salat, and I pray that it will encourage you to observe the contact prayers with more enthusiasm and spirit behind it. Thank you for watching. Salamun alaikum.